Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready to dive into a really big question. Why do some nations thrive while others just can't seem to catch a break?
It's a question that's puzzled people for centuries.
And we're tackling it with this amazing book, Why Nations Fail, by Darren Asoglu and James Robinson.
And get this, even Nobel Prize-winning economists are raving about it.
Yeah, when heavy hitters like Gary Becker and Peter Diamond give a book their stamp of approval, you know it's got to be insightful.
For sure. What makes this book so compelling is that it challenges a lot of the common assumptions we have about why some countries succeed and others, well, don't.
Right. Like we often hear things like, oh, it's their geography or it's their culture or even just they've had bad
Right,
leaders.
exactly. But these authors, they dig deeper. They argue that it all boils down to institutions.
Institutions.
Yeah, the rules of the game, the structures that shape how a society operates, they say that's the real make or break factor.
And the timing of this book couldn't have been more perfect.
Yeah.
It came out right in the middle of the Arab Spring.
Absolutely. People were taking to the streets, demanding change, and this book provided a powerful framework for understanding the very systems they were protesting against.
It was like people were experiencing these institutional failures firsthand.
Exactly. And it wasn't just some abstract theory. The book even mentions the protests in Egypt, how people inherently understood the connection between how their government worked and their own economic struggles.
It's like they were living the book in real time.
In a way, they were. So it's not as simple as saying, oh, those countries are just too hot or they need to change their culture.
Yeah, those explanations always felt a bit too easy, like they were missing something.
Right. And that's what's so refreshing about this book. They take on those simplistic arguments head on.
So let's start with geography. I mean, it's true that some places have more resources than others, but is that really the deciding factor?
That's where things get interesting. They use the example of North and South America. Hundreds of years ago, it was South America that was richer. Now the tables have turned. So geography clearly isn't destiny.
And throughout history, we've seen civilizations thrive in places that we might now consider challenging. So it's not just about where you are on the map.
Not at all. And then there's that whole culture argument,
Yeah, like certain cultures are just more prone to success.
which the authors completely debunk. They bring up the Congo people, who eagerly adopted European technologies,
Huh.
even literacy.
Really?
Yeah. And then there's the Lele people who, while using less advanced tools than their neighbors, were fully aware that better options existed. It wasn't a lack of knowledge or desire holding them back.
Okay, so if it's not geography or culture, is it just about having the right leaders? Get rid of the bad guys and everything's fixed.
Ah, if only it were that simple. While bad leaders can certainly make things worse, it's often a symptom of deeper issues.
It's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg.
Exactly. The real problem, according to these authors, is the type of economic and political institutions a country has in place.
So their argument is that these institutions are even more important than who's actually in charge.
Precisely. They're the underlying operating system of a nation. And to illustrate this, they take us on a fascinating journey through history, spanning continents and centuries.
Like going all the way back to Spanish colonization. Right. They talk about how in places like Colombia, the Spanish didn't just impose their will out of thin air, they often hijacked existing systems.
Exactly. They talk about the encomienda system, where the Spanish basically took over existing systems of forced labor.
Like the Incas' Mita system.
Exactly. They adapted these systems to serve their own purposes, extracting wealth from indigenous populations.
So instead of creating something entirely new, they just kind of repurposed what was already there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And these weren't just isolated incidents of greed. They were deliberate choices that became ingrained in the very fabric of the colonial system. These extractive institutions, as the authors call them, are designed to funnel resources towards a small, powerful elite.
So it's about control, really. Maintaining power and wealth in the hands of a few at the expense of everyone else.
Precisely. And sadly, it's a pattern we see throughout history, and even in the world today.
It's crazy that they even bring Adam Smith into the mix.
Right, the invisible hand guy. What's he got to do with all of this?
Well, he made this observation that the value of colonial output seemed to decrease the farther you got from the equator. And the authors argue that there's this hidden lesson in that observation.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's like different contexts, different resources, they all require different approaches. You can't just use a one-size-fits-all system for resource management.
That makes sense. It's about adapting to the specific circumstances, the environment, the resources at hand.
Exactly. And that leads us to another fascinating example they give, the early English colonies in Jamestown. Remember John Smith?
Oh yeah, the Pocahontas guy.
That's the one. Well, he actually pleaded with the Virginia Company to send skilled workers, not just adventurers looking to strike it
He
rich.
sounds like a smart guy.
He was. He understood that building a thriving colony required a different strategy.
It's like the difference between short-term exploitation and long-term investment.
Exactly. But sadly, not everyone got that memo, did they? Take the Carolina colony, for example. They tried to establish this rigid class system with their fundamental constitution.
Oh yeah, giving all the power to a select few, right.
Exactly. And that, my friends, is a perfect example of what the authors are getting at. The choice between embracing inclusive or extractive institutions has huge implications for a nation's future.
It's like choosing between a system that uplifts everyone versus one that keeps most people down.
Okay, so let's break this down for our listeners. What do we mean by extractive institutions? Paint a picture for us.
Imagine a system where a tiny group holds all the cards. They make the rules, they control the resources, and they ensure that the wealth flows mainly toward them. It's like a rigged game where the house always wins.
So basically, the odds are stacked against the vast majority of people.
Exactly. And they give the example of Barbados in the 17th century.
Mm.
A small group of sugar planters held all the power with laws in place to keep it that way.
It's like a self-perpetuating cycle of inequality.
Exactly. And on the flip side, you have inclusive institutions.
So what makes them different?
Think of it like a level playing field. Inclusive institutions create an environment where everyone has the opportunity to participate and succeed. They protect things like property rights.
So you can actually benefit from your hard work.
Exactly. And they encourage innovation because people know they'll be rewarded for their creativity. It's about creating a system where everyone has a stake in the game.
So instead of just trying to grab what they can, people are motivated to create and contribute because they know the system is fair.
Precisely. And to illustrate this contrast, they compare North and South Korea after World War II. Same people, same land, vastly different outcomes.
It's like a natural experiment.
It really is. North Korea, under Kim Il-sung, went down the path of absolute control, abolishing private property and stifling any form of dissent. South Korea, on the other hand, went in the opposite direction, encouraging private enterprise, protecting property rights, and promoting a market-driven economy.
And the results speak for themselves. South Korea, with its Samsung phones and Hyundai cars, became an economic powerhouse. North Korea, well, not so much. It really highlights how critical those institutional choices are.
Absolutely. And speaking of history's impact, they also delve into the Black Death, that devastating plague that swept through Europe in the 14th century.
Oh, wow, I can't even imagine. That must have been terrifying.
It was. Millions died. But what's fascinating is that the authors argue that this horrific event actually exposed and magnified the institutional differences that already existed between Western and Eastern Europe.
So it's like the plague acted as this sort of stress test on their systems.
Exactly. Labor became scarce, which should have, in theory, given workers more bargaining power. And in Western Europe, that's exactly what happened.
They were able to demand better conditions, more rights.
Exactly. The plague actually helped to break down the feudal system and push towards freer labor markets. But in Eastern Europe, where institutions were already more extractive,
Things went in the opposite direction.
unfortunately, yes. Instead of loosening their grip, the elites used the crisis to tighten their control, further entrenching serfdom and consolidating their power over the peasantry. It's a stark example of how institutions can either help or hinder a society's ability to adapt and recover from even the most devastating shocks.
It's kind of like how a crisis can really expose the flaws in a system, or, in the case of Western Europe, even shatter them and force a reset. But let's shift gears for a second and talk about innovation. The authors tell this really interesting story about a guy named William Lee who invented this revolutionary knitting machine called the stocking frame. You'd think he'd be hailed as a hero,
But he faced a ton of resistance.
Right, especially from Queen Elizabeth I.
Yeah, it's a classic case of what the authors call creative destruction. Progress and disruption, they often go hand in hand.
Because even though new technologies might ultimately make things better, they can also shake things up. And those in power, they don't always like that.
They fear that disruption. And in Queen Elizabeth's case, she was worried about the potential impact on the textile industry and the social unrest it might cause. She was like, hold on, this newfangled machine could throw everyone's lives into chaos.
even though in the long run it might have actually improved things for a lot of people.
Exactly. But those in power, they often prioritize stability, keeping things as they are. It's a tale as old as time.
And speaking of old, the authors talk about the Ottoman Empire and their resistance to the printing press, which seems crazy to us now,
I
right?
know, right? But they were really wary of the spread of knowledge and new ideas. They thought it might challenge their authority. They were like, information is power, and we want to keep it that way. Meanwhile, over in England,
The printing press was running wild.
exactly, helping to fuel the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, all those incredible leaps forward. Talk about a missed opportunity for the Ottomans.
Speaking of missed opportunities, what about the Soviet Union? They really went all in on that centrally planned economy. Initially, it seemed kind of appealing to some, this idea of equality, everyone working together for the common good.
It sounds good on paper, right?
Yeah,
But in reality,
it was a different story.
the Soviet system, while maybe well-intentioned, just couldn't keep up. Without incentives for innovation, without people being able to take risks and try new things, the economy just stagnated.
It's like they stifled the very creativity that drives progress. It's like that saying, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink.
Exactly. You can't force innovation. It needs the right conditions to flourish. And the Soviet Union just didn't have them. Which brings us to another heavy topic, colonialism. We can't talk about why some nations fail without addressing this massive elephant in the room.
It's impossible to ignore how that legacy continues to shape so many countries, especially in Africa.
Absolutely. The authors argue that colonial powers often imposed extractive institutions that served their own interests.
They weren't exactly known for their benevolent rule, were they?
Not really. They were all about extracting resources, enriching themselves, and not so much about setting up systems that would benefit the colonized populations in the long run.
They were playing the short game, not thinking about the long-term consequences.
Exactly. And we see the repercussions of that even today. They give the example of Sierra Leone, where slavery persisted even after the official end of the transatlantic slave trade. It lingered there all the way until 1928.
It's a stark reminder of how deeply entrenched those extractive systems can become. It's like trying to uproot a giant tree that's been there for centuries.
And the roots run deep. And we see in other parts of Africa, too. They talk about South Africa, where policies like the Natives Land Act of 1913 basically stripped black South Africans of their land.
Forcing them into a system of cheap labor.
Exactly. It was a deliberate creation of a dual economy, designed to benefit one group at the expense of another. It's a heartbreaking example of how intentional choices can lead to such deep and enduring inequalities.
It's like building a house on a foundation of injustice. It's no wonder it struggled with so many challenges, but it's not all doom and gloom, right? The authors do highlight some more hopeful examples, like Botswana.
Botswana, the shining star. They managed to avoid the so-called resource curse.
Which is when countries with an abundance of natural resources like diamonds or oil end up worse off.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Botswana, they used their diamond wealth wisely. They invested in education, infrastructure, good governance. They focused on building those inclusive institutions.
And they've seen remarkable economic growth and political stability. It gives you hope that a different path is possible.
It really does. But the authors also caution us against thinking it's an easy fix. They talk about this concept they call the iron law of oligarchy.
Which basically means that even after revolutions, even when you get rid of the old guard,
A new elite often emerges and just replicates those same old patterns of extraction. It's like a game of whack-a-mole,
you knock one down and another one pops right back up.
Exactly. And they use the example of Zimbabwe, where Robert Mugabe's regime took over from white minority rule. But instead of changing the system,
They just became the new oppressors.
sadly, yes. And it's a reminder that real change, lasting change, it's not just about swapping out the people at the top. It's about transforming the system itself.
It's about changing the rules of the game. And they make another interesting point. They argue that even in countries that appear to be democracies, there can be powerful groups that undermine the whole system.
Oh, absolutely. They use the example of Colombia, where you have paramilitary groups wielding significant influence.
So even though it has the trappings of democracy,
The reality is much more complicated. These groups, they often control territory, resources, and their influence seeps into politics and the economy. It's like this shadow network that operates beneath the surface.
making it really difficult to establish the rule of law, to build those institutions that are essential for a healthy society.
It's like trying to build a house on a foundation that's constantly shifting beneath you. You never know what's going to happen.
And they also talk about Argentina.
Oh, Argentina, a country with so much potential, but
But they've been plagued by these economic crises time and time again. They use that 2001 collapse when people couldn't even access their own bank accounts.
the Corralito. Yeah, that was a mess. It's a stark example of how fragile a system can be when those in power are more interested in serving themselves than serving the people.
Yeah.
It reminds us that no country is immune to those temptations of extraction.
It's like a cautionary tale for everyone. And then there's China.
Yes, China, the economic powerhouse. Everyone loves to point to China as this model of authoritarian growth.
Because they have seen incredible economic progress over the past few decades.
Right. But the authors caution against attributing it all to authoritarianism. Sure, they maintain tight political control, but they've also implemented significant economic reforms.
So it's more nuanced than just saying, oh, they're authoritarian, that's why they're successful.
Exactly. It's way more complex than that. And it challenges this idea that economic growth will inevitably lead to democracy.
Like it's this automatic progression.
Right. China's case shows us that economic development and political liberalization, they don't always go hand in hand. It's a good reminder that there are no simple answers to complex questions. We have to be willing to embrace that nuance.
To really dig into those complexities. And speaking of embracing nuance, the authors tackle this idea they call the ignorance hypothesis. Have you heard of this?
Oh, yeah. It's the idea that if leaders in struggling nations just knew better, they would choose different policies.
Like if they had the right information, they would magically make all the right decisions.
Exactly. But the authors argue that this view is incredibly simplistic and often used to justify these top-down solutions, like just throw more foreign aid at the problem and hope for the best.
Which, as we've seen time and time again, doesn't always work.
Right. They use the example of Afghanistan, where massive amounts of aid have been poured in, but it hasn't necessarily translated into the kind of transformative change that people were hoping for.
It's a reminder that real change has to come from within. It has to be driven by the people, not imposed from the outside.
Absolutely. You can't just airdrop democracy or development into a country. It takes root when the conditions are right, when the institutions are in place to support it.
And to wrap up this part of our deep dive, they highlight this inspiring story, the story of Brazil and the Workers' Party.
Yes. A story of hope.
They started as this grassroots movement advocating for the poor, the working class, and look at them now. They've made incredible strides towards greater inclusion, a fairer system.
It's a testament to the power of bottom-up change. It shows that lasting change, meaningful change, it often starts from the ground up.
You know, after a deep dive like this, it's easy to feel kind of overwhelmed.
Yeah.
I mean, we've covered a lot of ground here.
We really have.
From colonial history to the Black Death to, modern day examples. It's clear that these issues are,
Complex.
very complex.
Deeply ingrained.
Yeah, and often really disheartening.
Yeah.
But here's the thing that I think is so important.
Yeah.
Why nations fail. It doesn't just leave us with a sense of despair.
No, it doesn't.
It actually offers a glimmer of hope.
Yeah.
It's not just a diagnosis.
Right.
It's also, it suggests some potential solutions or at least paths forward.
Exactly. And it really emphasizes that while inclusive institutions are not a guarantee of success,
Sure.
they are really humanity's best shot at creating a more just and prosperous world for everyone.
They're like the foundation
Yeah.
upon which everything else can be built.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I find so inspiring
Yeah.
is that they highlight these examples of bottom-up change.
Yes.
Like the Workers' Party in Brazil.
Absolutely. That's such a powerful example.
They started as this small grassroots movement advocating for the poor, the working class, and look at the changes they were able to make.
Exactly. It shows that, it doesn't always have to be top down,
Right.
that real change can come from the people.
It's about empowering people,
Absolutely.
giving them the tools and the agency to shape their own destinies.
Yes. And that's what makes this book so powerful.
Yeah.
It reminds us that history isn't predetermined.
We're not just along for the ride.
No.
We have agency. We can make choices that shape our future and the future of our nations.
And it starts with understanding the dynamics at play,
Right.
like understanding how institutions work, how power operates.
And then we can start pushing for change,
Perfect.
whether it's through activism,
Yes.
supporting the right organization,
Absolutely.
or even just staying informed and engaged.
Having those conversations.
Yes, those conversations are crucial.
They are, because the more we talk about these issues,
Yeah.
the more aware we become of the challenges.
And the more likely we are to actually do something about them.
Exact.
And that's really what it all comes down to.
Action.
Action.
Yeah.
It's not enough to just read a book like this and go, oh, that's interesting.
Right.
We have to take that knowledge and turn it into something meaningful.
And that action can take many forms.
They can.
You know, it can be as simple as supporting an organization that promotes democracy and human rights.
Yeah.
It could be holding our own leaders accountable.
Voting.
Voting. Yes, absolutely.
Engaging in our communities.
It all makes a difference.
It all adds up.
It does.
Because ultimately, creating a fair, just more prosperous world.
Yes.
It's a team effort.
It is.
It requires everyone.
Everyone.
Citizens, governments, businesses, international organizations, everyone working together.
And it's not a passive endeavor.
No.
We have to be active.
We can't just rest on our laurels and assume that progress is inevitable.
Right. Progress is not a guarantee.
No.
It takes work. It takes commitment. It takes vigilance.
And it takes a whole lot of people rowing in the same direction.
Yes, it does.
But the payoff.
A better future.
A world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
That's a vision worth striving for.
Absolutely.
And it's a fight we can win.
So where does this leave you, dear listener? We've explored why some nations fail.
Yeah.
But the bigger question is, how can we, in our own spheres of influence, create the conditions where inclusive institutions can take root and flourish?
How can we be part of the solution?
Exactly. How can we be the change we want to see in the world?
Big question.
Big questions, but important questions.
Absolutely.
And ones that we all have a role in answering.
And this deep dive,
Yeah.
as insightful as it's been,
Yeah.
is just the tip of the iceberg.
Just the beginning.
If you really want to grapple with these ideas, Why Nations Fail is a must-read.
It's a challenging read.
It is.
But it's so worth it.
It really makes you think critically about the world.
It challenges your assumptions.
It does.
And hopefully it inspires you to take action.
Because the future is not yet written.
It's a work in progress.
We all have a role to play in shaping it.
So go out there.
Yes.
Make your voice heard.
Absolutely.
And let's build a better future together.
I love it.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time for another adventure in knowledge.